welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this event this morning. I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation about the built environment, and which I think is a very appropriate kind of conversation to be having here in the middle of Manhattan and sort of surrounded by all these tall old buildings. And I think being in New York, you really get a kind of very visceral sense. I was talking about this with someone yesterday of the challenge with the built environment. We have all these kind of huge towering buildings. A lot of them are very old. It gives you a sense of the scale of the building materials issue, also the sort of the time scale issue, the durability. I mean, we're making choices now about how we build buildings that are going to have very long-term implications for the climate. If you just look around all the stuff that's here that was built a long time ago, and to some extent, maybe we're stuck with some of that, or we can talk about how to deal with that part of the challenge. But I think what's so interesting about the work that the companies that we're going to speak with this morning is that they are all very focused on sort of the future of building. How do we take a new approach for whether it's any buildings? We're talking about data centers, all the infrastructure, all kinds of different stuff that is being constructed now, and trying to be very proactive and moving as quickly as possible, so that as we are going through this sort of super cycle of construction that we were just speaking about, we're making the right choices for the emissions in those things. And I think that this is an issue that has been, this sort of embodied carbon or in decarbonizing the built environment is often overlooked. We talk more about sort of operational emissions or reducing fossil fuel use in buildings, which obviously is important, but there's this whole other piece of the puzzle, and I think the companies here are also seeing that there's a business opportunity to be had in innovating solutions in that space. So really interested to kind of hear more about what they're working on. And by the way, my name is Tim McDonnell. I am the energy and climate editor for a business magazine called Semafor that's based here in New York. I have a newsletter on the energy transition that comes out every Wednesday and Friday morning. It's free, so please sign up for that, semafor.com. And then I'll just quickly introduce our guests, and then we'll dive into the conversation. We have Scott Tew from Trane Technologies, Nollaig Forrest from Holcim, and Tim Hill from Nucor, representing a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. And I won't speak too much for the guests, but maybe Scott, to start with you, I would love, first of all, just tell us a little bit about Trane and your philosophy for approaching this challenge that we're describing, and maybe we can start there.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for being here on a really nice New York morning. It's great to talk about Trane Technologies, but also this really important topic I've not actually heard a lot about this week, so this is an unusual session for several reasons. Trane Technologies is one of the world's largest cooling companies. We like to think of ourselves as a climate innovator because we use innovations to help cool and heat the world. In particular, things that are really top of mind now, which is how to electrify heating. We're the world's largest producer currently of heat pumps for commercial spaces, and 1 out of every 2 commercial buildings in places like Manhattan depend on Trane for some part of their solution for cooling or heating. And we have to be part of the conversation around decarbonizing buildings because there's a huge opportunity. 15% of the emissions from buildings is from heating and cooling, so we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution, and I'd like to think of us as part of the solution. And I'll talk in a few moments about what we're doing around embodied carbon, because you're right. We have talked a long time about how do we reduce operational emissions via things like efficiency, but we have an exciting announcement around embodied carbon I'll share later.
Nollaig, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about Holcim? And we were just speaking backstage about how you're sort of approaching this issue and the opportunity that you see here.
Yeah, with great pleasure. First of all, thank you so much for gathering us here today on such an essential topic as embodied carbon in the built environment. So Holcim is a leading building solutions company. We have essentially 2 business units: building materials that cover concrete, cement, that are considered hard-to-abate sectors that we are actively decarbonizing with the broadest range of technologies. And then we have our building envelope business that has to do with roofing and insulation, where we play a part in the operational carbon to try to improve energy efficiency, but also reduce heat leakages in buildings. So if we just step back and look at the big picture, the built environment represents about 40% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. A quarter of those emissions are happening at the construction phase. It's what we call the embodied carbon linked to the construction materials. where basically steel and concrete have a huge opportunity to play a big role. And then you have the operational carbon that was just referred to, that is linked to heating, cooling, and powering the building, that happens at the operational phase. And there are lots of technologies that are being deployed that are addressing that as well. So when you look at the certifications in the market today that are broadly used by architects and engineers, like the LEED certification for buildings or Envision for infrastructure, most of those certifications stop at the operational phase. They actually just basically look at those 3 quarters, and they very rarely go into the detail of the embodied carbon. And if we want to accelerate the adoption of low carbon solutions at that embodied phase, we need to create pull-through in the market. So the more demand we get up the value chain, the more procurement standards actually specify low carbon solutions from the building developers, the infrastructure developers, the more we basically get pulled through at our level, because we're at the very beginning of the chain, we're at the material solution level, and the people that we engage with directly as our customers, they engage with multiple different stakeholders, but what matters is that this procurement setter, the building owner or the infrastructure owner at the beginning of the chain, sets the most ambitious standards from operational to embodied, and if we do that, we can basically pull through a broader scale up the adoption of low carbon solutions.
And Tim, tell us a little bit about how Nucor is addressing this, and I think decarbonizing steel is one of the most interesting parts of the energy transition. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you guys have been approaching this problem, how you see it.
Yeah, thank you. And as Nollaig said, thanks Scott and the Trane team. Thanks Shelby for getting all of the hard work done in the background to get us all here, so I appreciate that. Nucor is North America's largest steel producer. We are also the largest recycler in the Western Hemisphere. So I think that's a key underpinning of how we have helped transition the U.S. steel industry to being one, if we would believe, the lowest embodied carbon steel industry around the globe. And the way we do that is by using electric arc furnaces, by using recycled steel. It's a circularity play, candidly, and that's what's so cool to be here with Trane, kind of a first mover in this space. And one of the very earliest customers that we had come to us and say, this is important, I need you to focus on this. We sell them steel, we buy their products, it's very circular. So it's important with our customers to be focused on what they're focused on. Obviously, that's what drives our business. Where this has evolved in the last couple of years, and everything that Nollaig said, I completely support. We're at the front side of this. We're talking to people in the supply chain. Construction is very complicated, as most all of you probably know. Lots of layers of influencers, and as I'm fond of reminding people, every time you have an influencer, they have margin. And when you start to move around pieces on that, people get really weird when you start to touch the margin that they're making for doing what they're doing. That's really key number one. We're talking about moving margin around this chessboard, and that becomes a challenge. It's also really deep. The construction industry is really deep. There's a lot of influencers. And so where we've tried to move things is to talk to the people at the top, the developers, people that are setting the standards for what's going to be built. This beautiful building that's going up behind us here, right? What does the owner, the future inhabitants of that building want to see? And then what solutions are available today? What we've been surprised with, living in the United States, over 50% of the product that we sell goes into construction. We're shocked that most people don't know how steel's made. So they come at it with a very old thought process of, this is a very dirty business. It's hard to abate. We argue that. We don't think it's hard to abate at all. We think it's just going to be very expensive to abate around the globe. And so there's two areas, and really to your point, Tim. Green iron, where's the carbon-free iron units going to come from in the future? And we've invested in some of those technologies today. There's more coming. But really, the issue for all of us, and it's not just steelmakers, it's all of us as human beings, plugging in my watch and my phone and my iPad and my laptop and my car and everything else that I own, is where the electrons of the future are going to come from. Energy is clearly the issue. We're leaning in on that. We believe nuclear for carbon-free, firm baseload energy is absolutely critical. I think the move that Microsoft made last week with Constellation is an absolutely huge move. And I don't think that's the only one that's being considered. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that as well.
That's great. Scott, could you say a bit more about where the sort of original impetus for looking at this problem came from? Was this something that your customers were asking for you to think about decarbonizing these materials, or responding to regulatory or policy pressure, or how did this journey kind of get started?
Well, I could say it was not policy, even though we're 6 weeks away from an election. I think that this theme of Climate Week is the important one. It's time. And I think that's where we were as a company. We've been working for years on a very significant operational emissions, actually a product emissions reduction goal of 1 billion metric tons by 2030. It's still the single largest science-based commitment to reduce product use emissions. So our people have been all in. We've been all in on the innovation, all in on our own activities, and then talking with customers about what's possible on the operations side. And to your point, customers have asked us, what else is there? What about the other end? And embodied carbon is the other side, something we, at one point years ago would not have wanted to talk about because we really had not done the hard work of figuring out how do you go and reduce embodied carbon because, as Tim said, it can be complicated. And so that led us on a journey for the past year, or a little over a year, where our teams have been working on how would we begin to reduce embodied carbon. And fast forward to where we are today, I'm really pleased to announce, and we announced earlier this week publicly, that we're committing to reduce the embodied carbon of our products by 40% by 2030. And that's in line with a lot of groups, WPCSD, the World Economic Forum, and others have been working for a couple of years now on what does it take to make a difference? What's the percentage needed by 2030? And all of this is still in line with the Paris Accord, which is the real science behind what's needed. And so we're the first company in the industry to make this commitment. What it means is we'll be working very closely with the Holcims, with Nucor, with others on those materials, priority materials that we have to do better on. And thank goodness we have found some great partners who are willing to do their part in helping us reduce that part. Because really, in my view, is that embodied carbon is sort of the hidden calories of our buildings. It's the thing you don't think about. It's that late night snack that over time sort of becomes the problem. And I think that's where we are on embodied carbon. Both of my guests here with me today talked about the operational side we've been talking about for years. We know how to do that one. What we've not talked about are those hidden things. And so today is the day that begins.
When you're looking in your supply chain and trying to identify those sort of opportunities or the parts that you need to address, I mean, what's the hardest part of that, or where are the blind spots that you've identified, or particularly tricky bits of that process? Yeah,
so we have thousands, tens of thousands. I don't even know the number. Some people say 32,000, some say 25,000. We have a lot of suppliers. That's like boiling the ocean. We can't do that. So instead we categorize the suppliers into several key groups. It's no surprise to anyone in this audience. We make air conditioning. They're made of metal. Anyone want to guess what we're after? Metals first. We'll go after steel, copper, aluminum. And those are very complicated industries. Tim was just describing that. Is there a way to do better there? Yes. So we're meeting with those suppliers and asking the questions of, have you made a commitment? Are you working on reducing emissions? Are you looking at alternative materials that you can provide to us? We have to be willing to sit at the table and ask all those questions.
No, I want to go back to the point you were raising about sort of reaching up the value chain for that demand signal. Is that happening already? I mean, do you find that, whether it's sort of public procurement for infrastructure like we were talking about, or the Amazons or whoever's building data centers, these types of sort of end use, the people at the top of that value chain, are they sending the right demand signal yet? And if not, how do you start to change more minds about that?
So you can see first mover companies like Trane here today, who is definitely sending the right demand signals, and I think that's a great opportunity for all of the players in Trane's value chain to put their innovation to work to meet that green demand. We need more first movers like Trane Technologies. So there is an emerging group of first mover companies that are putting their green procurement to work to lead the shift in the value chain. We need just much more to reach critical mass. In our business, about 40% is government driven, so we're engaging extensively with state authorities to also make that happen at the public procurement level, so that every single public building is leading the way, showing by example what's possible. So I think it's really important to basically put your money where your mouth is, like what Trane Technologies is doing here today, to lead that change. Now, I get very excited when I see the technologies. As you said, we are a possible to abate sector. The technologies exist. We have technologies today that can basically get you to net zero cement, and even better than that, we can actually put technologies inside that can capture CO2, that can sequester CO2 in cement and sequester CO2 in concrete. So what you're talking about is if you do the right design, you're actually going to use your bridges and your roadways to be carbon sinks. That technology exists today. So if we just figure out how to play the value chain to unlock that market, we can scale this up. So our issue right now is unlocking the market and basically finding ways to scale up these novel technologies. And you can even take it one step further. We're basically all trying to figure out how to deal with this energy transition that's so essential for every single sector. The MIT published a paper recently where they combined concrete with carbon black, and they can turn concrete into a battery. So can you imagine that one day our homes can be our batteries, or that our pathways can charge our electric cars? So I think that we're at the verge of a revolution in materials. I think, as you said, it's the missing piece of the puzzle.
And we're not waiting on AI.
Exactly. We're like the real things we're the backbone of urbanization. So I think we're on the verge of being able to take these technologies to scale, and now is the moment.
Just one more question on this the demand signal kind of thing. To what extent is there a green premium for some of the decarbonized technologies, and is that pricing signal part of the constraint on the demand?
Well, I think that's it's the $1 million question, is that we have to invest in these technologies that require billions of investments. So we need to make the business case work. In the US, there's very interesting incentives from the grants to the infrastructure, but also the IRA. So we do benefit from some upfront support, but also if we can get some price premium in the market, it would accelerate the deployment of these technologies for sure.
So at the moment, you still have to kind of convince people to pay a little bit more for this stuff.
At the moment, anybody is asking for a better solution at a price parity point, and I think that we have to figure out how to sell the value so that we can basically get the pricing to be in line with the technology that's involved to put into these products, make them more advanced.
Yeah, that makes sense. Tim, just to kind of drill in on the technology piece of this, can you just say a little bit about how you guys are approaching greener steel and what I know you're working with Electra. Tell us a little bit about that and what's your approach here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I touched on it briefly just a minute ago. There's really two areas for the steel industry to think about. Green iron, because even if you use scrap like Nucor does, and we use 75 to 80% of all the heats that we make have scrap as a base. Some of the products, they're 100%. Some of the products that would go into automotive or things like that, they're probably closer to 60%. You're going to have a percentage of iron units that need to go into that mix to make the steel that we're making. It's no different for Nucor. It would be no different for any other steel maker. So there's green iron. We've worked with Electra. Boston Metal has some technology that's similar. It's different in concept, but it's very similar as an output. The Electra product is really fascinating because they're using waste iron that is just leftover. Iron fines that are left over after mining that are in piles around the world. They need to be used. It's a waste product. They're using renewable energy, low temperature electrolysis to make a carbon-free iron product. Extremely nascent technology. I think that's the other piece of this. You brought up demand signals. First of all, I would say, just to comment on that really quickly, that's on us. We're consumers, right? If it's important, we'll pay for it. If it's really not important, we're not going to pay for it, right? And so that's really the move that I think we as a society are facing today, is how important really are green products, right? And there's some demographic shift here that's happening, and I can feel it this week, much different than last year the same week, right? There's a different shift and a different feeling in the air. As we look at those technologies, green iron is part of it. The other side of it is green electrons. I've touched on that. We believe that's nuclear, right? And because we need firm baseload energy. And I think the concern, obviously, with nuclear is, if you're in my demographic, and I'm not the youngest guy here, obviously, most people will say, if you say nuclear, they're going to say 3 Mile Island. Now, it'll be interesting what they say now, since they're going to reopen 3 Mile Island. But most people will say that, then they'll say Chernobyl, then they'll say Fukushima, and it's just a horror story after horror story. My kids are 30 and 28. They don't see it the same way. They see it as, hey, this is an untapped opportunity. Why aren't we doing this? I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Again, demographics, I think, will move the market.
Scott, are there other sort of important bottlenecks that are worth mentioning? We were sort of talking about this demand signal. There's a constraint on the availability of affordable, low carbon, steady electricity, I think is a really important one for all of the technologies here. Is there more that you would like to see from the policy side that would be helpful for tackling some of these emissions, or what are the other pieces of the puzzle that are missing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was with Administrator Carnahan with the GSA this week, and one of the things I echo that she said was we still need some clear definitions. We still need more data to make better decisions, because that's a bit Wild West right now. LCAs, which are life cycle assessments, EPDs, environmental product declarations, we're really lacking in these areas of many of these materials. Some companies are doing a really good job of trying to provide that. We can't make all the decisions that are needed without all the data. And it's just missing because this is unusual. Thanks to leaders like Nucor and Holcim, that's changing. But across the spectrum of all those providers, we're sort of in a huge data gap currently, and we need more data.
Is that a role for government to mandate that kind of thing? Or?
I mean, that was the question that she got. I won't give her answer, but her point was who should set the definition? We have groups that have done it for the building operations side for years, like LEED that you mentioned. We have others like the Well Building Performance Standard. Trane Technologies really prefers a building performance standard that talks about how a building performs while it's doing what it was designed to do, which is more than just how it was designed, it was how it operates. We think that's important. We need something like that on the other side of embodied carbon. Remember, we're building a bridge here between operational emissions and embodied emissions, yet the bridge is not fully built yet. We're still building it, so that's the way I see it. We're talking about a footbridge. We need something much larger.
I agree.
How about a concrete steel bridge?
Thank you. To add on to what Scott's saying, I think the amount of conversations that we have where someone says, hey, I need to buy green steel, and then we follow it up and say, okay, and this is not Trane. The cool thing about companies like Trane is that they knew what they were talking about when they got into the discussion. I think that's a critical element of moving progress, right? So many people, and this is not to shame anybody, because everybody's learning at a different scale, and there's a whole process going on. But the amount of conversations we have where someone says, hey, I need green steel. All right, what do you need? I don't know, because somebody just told me I needed to buy green steel, and there's no definition in the market of what that means, right? I think getting to that, and it should be carbon. I mean, is this a discussion about decarbonization, or is it about something else, right? We think it's about decarbonization, which then says you set a carbon threshold and say if you're at or below that, you're green. And then you can have a real substantive conversation with your customers about what they're really looking for. And then LCAs become a lot easier because you can plug those numbers in and you can get to that end result.
To build on that whole data point, so we support all of our products with EPDs, environmental product declarations. Our objective is to make our low carbon concrete the mainstream product that we can sell at price parity, so no premium. And that represents a 30% CO2 reduction versus the market standard. We're trying to bring this product in the market as much as possible. We were able to work with a number of states here through the Bike Clean initiative to specify 20% lower CO2 in concrete. So we're really trying to move the needle on that, and then if we can go even further down the chain of even lower carbon, then we can deploy other technologies. But I think to talk about that image of the bridge in concrete and steel that we have to build between the operational and embodied carbon, this is a moment in time in North America that is unprecedented. I think it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. You have the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. I think it's a $1.3 trillion investment by the government in infrastructure. You have the IRA that's supporting also a whole bunch of policies in this area. You have the reshoring of supply chains with a whole building up of manufacturing presence in North America to strengthen the Made in America for America economy. You also have the digital economy that's booming. We saw earlier this week that there's been a $100 billion fund commitment to support the infrastructure for data centers, the building of the data centers to the renewable electricity required to support that. And then you have a housing shortage. That's an ongoing thing. You take all of this together, there is a momentum in construction in this market right now that if we could couple it with this green demand, I think would be really benefiting all stakeholders across the value chain.
And that feels like that was what I was sort of alluding to earlier about this window in time, because I think if you miss that opportunity or make the wrong choices in this about material selection or whatever in this moment, then of course the implications of those choices last for a long time. You don't get to, we're not building tons of building, it's not an ongoing process, right? So Nollaig, could you say, just to jump back to the technology piece, could you say a little bit about how Holcim is just sort of approaching the technology of decarbonizing concrete? And you guys have done some work with Sublime Systems, right? Or you had some news around them recently. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how you're working with climate tech, innovators like Leah in this space?
Yeah, definitely. So just to make it super simple, cement has two main drivers of CO2 reduction. 40% is linked to energy, and what we're doing is we're shifting towards alternative fuels to basically reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. We already have about 15 operations around the world today that can operate with over 80% of non-fossil fuels. And then the second big driver, that's 60%, it's the chemical reaction of the product. Basically, it emits CO2 and it's in the chemical process. So what the Sublime team have done, taking an entirely fresh approach to this, is they basically have re-engineered a process where you don't use a big heating mechanism, you use electricity at an ambient temperature, and you use clean electricity, and then you take a carbon-free mineral and you melt that mineral to create essentially a version of cement. And they've been able to do that in a way that is compatible with traditional cement. So we know today that we can take a totally different approach using clean electricity, using carbon-free materials that get you to the same end product. Today, their solution is about 70% lower CO2. We've got, with our engineering teams, we've got great prospects to get it to 100%. Right now, they're basically getting ready to scale up their first commercial plant that we're investing in with them. It's in Boston. And then it's about how do you take this technology and scale it up as fast as possible. So the technology pathway is there, it is feasible. And then on top of that, so we're an investor in Greentown Labs, which is the largest incubator for climate tech startups in North America. So we get prime access to all the leading startups that are working in this area. And there's another really exciting startup that's in Colorado, Travertine, and they basically can take a byproduct waste from the fertilizer industry, and they can use it as a mineral in the cement formulation that can also capture CO2 in the product. So if you combine the Travertine technology with the Sublime technology, you end up with a product that is near zero and that actually captures CO2 inside. So all these technologies exist. Now we have to figure out the economics and how to open up the market from a regulatory perspective and from a demand perspective.
Tim was mentioning the role of nuclear power here. I mean, is green electricity a constraint on how well you're able to use those technologies, or how do you sort of get sufficient power for doing that?
Exactly. So if you imagine the scaling up of a solution like Sublime, you would be relying on clean electricity, so you enter that ballpark as well. We're also looking into hydrogen as another source of very promising energy.
I think that's such an interesting piece of all of this, because we're going through this. We've been talking about data centers or EVs, decarbonizing industry, whatever it is. There's this huge demand for clean power. I think it's totally changing the game from the last 50 years. And a lot of people have amazing, innovative solutions, or e-fuels for SAF or all this stuff. Very amazing technology, but everyone is sort of everyone needs a lot more green electricity. So I think figuring out that piece of the puzzle is going to be really challenging. So. I guess maybe one other question about, and I promised Scott that I wouldn't ask too many questions about AI, but I can't avoid talking about data centers. It's been the big theme of Climate Week. No, but just to kind of connect some of the pieces here, building data centers is a big business for you guys now. We've been talking a bit about this demand signal from tech companies or others. Are you getting that kind of when you're working with data center clients or customers? Are you getting that demand signal for them? What's the appetite from data center developers, tech companies for pursuing specifically for data centers to pursue the types of solutions that we're talking about here?
Yeah. So the simple answer is yes. We are getting the signals. Thankfully, we're all viewing this not as a construction challenge, but more as a design opportunity. It's around designing early. Thank goodness many of the tech companies they're progressive thinkers on both the construction and on the operations side. So it really plays well to what we're talking about today. And I know the conversations that Trane Technologies is having with our customers in the tech space is all about, they're very interested in every facet, every possibility for reducing emissions. So from the embodied side of how things get constructed and what the materials are, to how the building will operate once it's in place. So it's a complement to two things. One is their progressive thinking, but also it's a moment in time. We're not retrofitting. Many of these are new builds, and you can make much better decisions on the design side of a new build than you can on retrofit. There's great opportunities on the operational emissions side of a retrofit, but the beams and the concrete, they're already in place for a retrofit. The good news is that data centers, for the most part, are new builds, and so we can do it right from day one.
And if you have repeatability, I think there's an openness now. If you go back 5 years ago when we were starting into these builds, everybody had a custom design for every data center, needed to be a little different. That runs cost up, and you can't have repeatability, right? I think that willingness to replicate something that's working,
that's changing a bit now.
Changing.
It's becoming more standardized.
Absolutely.
And I think it's been a super exciting also collaboration for us to work with these big tech minds, because right now we're even putting AI to work to optimize the mixed design of concrete. They're even using their technology to help us improve our mixes. I think that's fantastic.
She couldn't resist.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. So I think there's a great synergy there. I think they are a game changer. They're trying to change. They are a force for good.